Have you ever felt like your therapist doesn't get where you come from? Have you ever been lectured about doing things your own way or setting up boundaries when in your situation it's just not possible? Hopefully not everybody has, but for the people that do, you're not wrong in saying you can't. See, there's a cultural difference here, a need to be part of the group that a lot of therapists don't account for. Because, simply put, psychology wasn't built with that in mind. Psychology, in its modern form, is rooted in what we call the West, and so whatever's specific to the outgroup, essentially everything else, gets pushed to the wayside, never taught as core subject material. Now, if you're going to a therapist, you want the principles of psychological theory and treatment to apply to you. But if psychology only exists from a Western perspective, that will be impossible, right? Well, maybe not. In this video, I want to find the psychology outside of the psychology, the treatments and observations of the mind made by the rest of the world's cultures. I want to determine if psychology is a universal concept, because if it is, then we can employ ulterior methods to better fit ulterior viewpoints, allowing you to feel like you belong. If that sounds interesting, then sit back and enjoy, because we're going down the rabbit hole that is the history and anthropology of the human mind. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I want to show you what brought me down this rabbit hole in the first place. This is a special issue journal from the American Psychological Association on decolonial psychology, a recent concept of treatment designed to reverse internalized feelings of cultural inferiority. Essentially, the notion that one group takes prevalence over another can be best reflected in any practice that prioritizes Western theory. So, by integrating indigenous and multicultural perspectives into the therapeutic office, and by pointing out where a sense of cultural identity has been lost, subconscious feelings of grief and anxiety specific to a diverse clientele can finally be resolved. Let me give an example from the journal itself. The Rural Human Services program at the University of Alaska, devoted to training new generations in human services jobs, continues to employ Alaska Native elders in the classroom as complements to professors providing more practical explanations of lecture material and as counselors to communicate with in times of need. Students in these classrooms have noted their ability to provide insights through implications, how they would make sure to take someone aside if they needed help in processing something. One even recites how, while suffering from an anxiety attack, her classroom elder managed to provide healing by acknowledging the physical space the emotion seemed to be stuck at. These elders refer to themselves more as spiritual guides than mental health counselors, but if their goal is to make someone be and feel better, then there's a pretty significant connection here, one the APA suggests could be an ideal substitute for the therapeutic relationship. If psychology can be decolonized, then something must exist beyond what has been colonially instilled. There must be a basis of working knowledge derived not from scientific institutions, but from lived experiences accurately passed down over countless generations. That's what's been referred to by the elders themselves, an inherited tradition representing the wisdom of a group with deep ties to its environment and ancestors, a tradition that needs to be maintained among indigenous North American communities to counter Western exclusionist concepts of what the model person ought to be. Do I think the role of the elder should subsume that of the psychotherapist? No. Both are preferable, and realistically not every indigenous American is going to have access to elder guidance given how much of the practice has already been lost. But I do think there's something outside of the realm of Western psychology, and if there's one thing, there are more. Thus begins our journey beyond the Western world. Here's where I have to make the distinction between what Western and non-Western psychology actually are. See, when we think of psychology in the traditional sense, we think of Freud, Pavlov, Rogers, and if we want to go really far back, Wundt. These are empiricists, researchers and practitioners basing the majority of their beliefs on the experiences they've personally witnessed, and the numerical data they've been able to collect. Empiricism in of itself serves as the basis for all of modern science, having stemmed from the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. And because of that, what we consider Western psychology isn't rooted in a place so much as it's rooted in a time, when what existed before was suppressed by what came after. So what was European psychology before Western psychology? Well, like with the native elders, it was regarded as spiritual, or to more accurately fit the European definition, religious. Oftentimes, sickness was acknowledged as a manifestation of sin, whether it be sin personally committed or sin as was committed onto the individual. Sickness could be expelled from the individual through traditional medical practices, Or the sin itself could be eliminated at the roots through confession, a practice of expressing your guilt and emotions to a preordained minister that still goes on today. Priests have even been talked to in replacement of modern therapists. They're trained to offer guidance to those seeking emotional support, as has been passed down over millennia. It's important to note that, in a medieval context, the concept of sin is defined not as negative intent, but as negative experiences. And so by modern accounts, it can be better defined as trauma. So it stands to reason that, prior to the onset of empiricism, Europe regarded talk therapy as a means of resolving personal distress. Only it was practiced using an inherited body of wisdom and took into account a deep connection between the mind and body. But then, what changed? Why were the confession and the mind-body connection pushed to the side? Well, fundamentally, I think it had to do with a growing rejection of the Catholic Church, first initiated by newfound contact with the wider world. See, while an isolated medieval Europe struggled under Catholic rule, the Islamic empires in the Middle East, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, and eventually the Ottomans, were compiling theories in classical Greece, Egypt, and India to produce a much more thorough account of the human mind. Thus entered the Maristan system, designed to classify mental disorders and provide measured clinical treatments towards them. Deriving most of their knowledge from the work of Abu Zayd al-Baqi, Maristans were especially trained in identifying what they considered phobic, obsessive, aggressive, and melancholic disorders, precursors to what we now consider anxiety, OCD, anger issues, and depression. And once these conditions were identified, they were treated through early forms of exposure therapy, cognitive therapy, and zakafur, a form of meditation reliant on a spiritual understanding of the greater universe and one's place in it. Most of the techniques employed here were practical, measured and documented through an intellectual approach comparable to empiricism. In fact, the Greek and Indian texts early Islamic understandings of the universe were built off of already emphasized learning through empirical observation. So really, an empirically based concept of psychology didn't start in Europe. It existed in waves throughout much of human history, and only rose to prominence in a post-medieval society because of the cultural osmosis of the Crusades, the Pax Mongolica, of all the times European nobility especially got a taste of what they could be beyond the church's control. An adoption of a style of psychological theory that would lay the groundwork for things like exposure therapy and the diagnosis of OCD gave Europe a means to separate itself from what it currently was, as could be seen from the world right outside its doorstep. And yet, Islamic psychology is not Western psychology. Zakafur especially reflects that spiritual side, more particularly an awareness that the individual is interconnected with their environment. Put a pin in that. Connectedness. That's what divides Western psychology from everything else. The development of modern empiricism was a direct attempt to distance ourselves from the cultural past, both for the colonized and for the colonizer. And as such, it takes the individual and detaches them from wherever they came from, whatever spiritual beliefs they've inherited. Of course, that's not to say Christian values haven't influenced Western psychological practice to any extent. But doesn't it make sense that a society becoming versed in the game of colonialism, of constantly transposing themselves onto other groups, would value detachment? So then, if we're looking for other forms of psychology, we're looking for continuities, for similar conceptions of the mind that can be drawn back to a common ancestor. And actually, rather than conceptions of the mind, what we really need to be looking for are conceptions of the soul, the self as can be nebulously transposed onto anything. Does that widen our options? Surprisingly, by a lot. You'd be surprised by how much we can conceive of as psychology, and you'd be surprised by how much of it connects. What's a process that always needs special emotional attention? Grieving. There are so many different ways of grieving in so many different cultures, all with their own perception of what happens to a soul, if anything at all, after death. What about wisdom deities? There are a lot of them, and how they act kind of provides the mythological basis for how that culture perceives wisdom as a whole. Dreams are regarded as part of the brain here in the West, but to other cultures, dreams can be a separate realm entirely. They can be tantamount to the human experience, as is the case with the Aboriginal dream time. But it's in the evolution of Buddhism, a faith very often associated with mental health, accurately or not, that we find a lineage standing out from the rest, a distinct continuity that exists parallel to Western psychology and the psychological bloodlines from which it was derived. Buddhism was designed to address personal dissatisfaction with a world marked by suffering, and so it's taken center stage in a world of Eastern psychology, both in its diverse range of practices and in the ways it regards the self. And most critically, it survived the test of time to the point that it holds equal prevalence with Western therapy in most people's heads, even garnering some empirical evidence of its own. But first, we need to identify the faith at its roots. Buddhism originated as an offshoot of Hinduism, a further reflection of the intellectual revolution that emerged out of Vedic India. And as was consistent with the Bhagavad Gita, Hinduism's holy text, desire and attachment were viewed as the cause of personal misery. In essence, the unconscious struggle to attain something causes stress. Where Buddhism differs, however, is in the belief that you can reach a point beyond desire, where unconscious conflicts can be resolved at the source. Such a point is called nirvana, a full realization of the self to be congruent with their ideal, and to attain it, one must dedicate themselves to the middle path, a life of balance between conflicting forces. Does any of that sound familiar? Unconscious conflict, self-actualization, and the concept of the ego all share striking similarities to ideas rooted in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy. Buddhism in particular likely influenced self-actualization to some extent, but for the most part it's simply two different approaches coming to the same conclusions. Western psychology has taken up the concept of client-centered therapy, wherein the role of the therapist is to validate and encourage the client to be who they want to be. And likewise, a central tenet of Buddhism is the ability of any individual to achieve nirvana, as is initiated by the individual and aided by those further along on the path. It's no surprise then that Buddhist techniques have remained relevant throughout much of the Eastern world. Take, for example, meditation, a largely universal process, and yet we associate it with Asian cultures in particular because of the specific practices Buddhist meditation may have the individual employ. Nikon meditation, originating in Japan, focuses purely on the cycling of stress throughout the body, acting more as an exercise than relaxation. Samatha, originating again in India, is the process of sorting out the full range of one's thoughts and feelings by giving them time to settle, often described like letting layers of oil and water divide in a glass. Here, a central concept that internal conflict has mechanisms that can be worked around provides Buddhist teachings with a sense of tangible self-improvement. But perhaps the most interesting example I came across was that of the mandala, an art form originating from Tibetan Buddhism involving the creation of complex patterns that require extreme focus. Mandalas have been similarly used in Western originating psychoanalysis for their ability to incite introspection. But in Tibetan Buddhism specifically, there's one extra step. Once the mandala is complete, it's destroyed. The sand used to make it is wiped away and recycled for future use. And so the process of introspection from which complex insights could have been derived were compartmentalized, leaving only the insight itself. The main purpose of the mandala's destruction is to emphasize that nothing lasts forever, that it's okay to let things go, and that what truly matters is the impact the experience left behind. But moreover, the practice represents a memory that can't be erased, a state of progress that can always be returned to. Whereas Western psychology is detail-oriented, Eastern psychology is abstract and holistic. The latter sees the forest where the former sees the trees. Is either better than the other? No, but why settle for one approach when we can use both? In fact, for as much as scientific data provides a good basis for effective therapy, religious and spiritual philosophies inherited by the client should be a central part of the conversation too. If you belong to a particular cultural identity, you should have the right to a therapist well versed in that culture's perspective. Or, at the very least, the therapist should be willing to learn and interpret the perspectives you provide them. Because, even through sharing a perspective, you're re-engaging with its meaning by putting it in your own words. And maybe, when the therapist is able to make the connections between approaches that we know are there, you'll feel a little bit more like they get you. Which leads me to bring up one last thing. A trend that consistently, across the board, separates Western psychology from everything else. See, in pretty much every other culture there exists a concept that emotions are shared, that the grief or joy of one person ought to become the grief or joy of everyone within a community. Typically, the concept works well to address systemic pressures like prejudice or migration, that don't simply affect one individual. But even in cases of personal loss, there's a belief that the sharing of emotion between people allows the individual to not have to carry everything around alone. Such is synonymous with a collectivistic society, one that emphasizes groups over individual achievement. But it wouldn't be possible for it to exist alongside Western therapy. What you need is a group of people that have felt the same way as you, gone through the same experiences to the extent that it produces a collective identity. And a therapist can help you to find that. Individuality is always going to be allowed, of course, But you don't have to fight your battles all on your own either. Others have fought them before you. In fact, for whatever culture you come from, the best solutions can be found in looking back to the generations of strategists having dealt with and mastered those same battles for millennia. Anxiety, depression, OCD, they might have new names, but they've always been a part of the human condition, as have been their treatments. So keep your mind open to the subtle forms of therapy that may apply, uniquely, to you. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you appreciated the video, and leave a comment if you've got anything interesting to add. This isn't normally the kind of video I make on this channel. This is more so the result of a school project, but if you're interested in movies, games, TV shows, then feel free to check out the other videos on my channel. I've done theories, analyses, original horror shorts, and for anybody that regularly watches my content, if anybody actually does, there should be something more akin to what I usually make coming out in the next couple weeks. In fact, sound off what kind of videos you want to see in the future. For now though, have a good day, and always be creative, because when you make the rules, the possibilities are endless.